Be sure to check out the Mob Programming Conference in Burlington, Massachusetts on April 12th and 13th. Some topics covered will be what is mob programming, test-driven development in a mob, transitioning from pairing to mobbing, exploratory testing in a mob with Lisa Crispin, digging into a legacy code base in the mob, facilitation techniques, and much more. Once again, that's April 12th and 13th in Burlington, Massachusetts. And you can go to agilegamesnewengland.com for more information. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Agile Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Troy Lightfoot, and with me I have another Agile Uprising member, Chris Merman.
Hey.
And tonight we have a very special guest. His name is Woody Zuill. Am I pronouncing your last name correct?
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
So Woody, I would say, is known for a lot of things, but maybe best known for being the inventor of mob programming.
Is that a correct statement, Woody? Would you say that that's what you're best known for? I'm curious. What do you think you're best known for?
Oh, well, yeah, I'd say that mob programming is what I'm best known for. I don't know if I'm known as the inventor of it, but I'd like to say I was there when we originated the idea. So I was part of the group that was discovering how to work this way and why we might want to work this way, or the people who stumbled on this. I was there, part of those folks. So, that's close to being an inventor.
How about this? The public face of the invention. Does that make sense?
Sure.
That's even the sexier name.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, Woody. So maybe if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and when it comes to mob programming, and how did it start? What is it kind of, first of all, and where did it come from?
Well, a real quick introduction to myself is I started programming back in the very early 1980s because I had bought a computer. Those were the days you could buy a little, a tiny computer that didn't cost a fortune. And I wanted to use software. I wanted to buy and use software, but the software that was available to buy and to do the things I wanted to do wasn't of very good quality. And it occurred to me that I could also write software that wasn't of very good quality, so maybe I should give it a try. And I did, and it turned out to be something I was really interested in. After just a few, weeks of trying to write software, I really started loving it. So that grew into my profession after a number of years, and there we are. So I've been programming about 35 years. I'm involved with Agile stuff since probably 1999, so that would be the days of proto-Agile, before it was called Agile. And even going back to the very earliest days of me writing software, because every night I would write some code that I could use the next day. So I was in this model of writing a little bit of code that I could use almost immediately. And that's sort of the modern, I would say, Agile model of software development. So that's enough of my background. Let's talk a little bit about mob programming. So mob programming itself is just an outgrowth of the idea of let's figure out how to work well together. And I was working at a place, Hunter Industries, which is a manufacturer of very high quality landscape irrigation products and other things as well. But in those days, they were mostly focused on irrigation stuff. And I was hired to help a team become more proficient and maybe become agile. And in so doing, we were focused on working well together. And along the way, we stumbled on this idea of all gathering around a single computer to look at some code and suggest to each other how we would want to work on it. And that turned into us actually working on it together. And that, to me, was the beginning of mob programming. Within a 2-hour period of working on something together, we all realized this is going way better than we would expect. Let's do more of it. And that grew into the bigger world of what we now call mob programming.
And Woody, could you tell us just essentially the kind of, I'm going to call it a lightweight, kind of like the rules of mob programming, and how you came up with them?
Oh, sure. Well, initially, we had been doing these a style of coding dojo. A dojo is a place to practice. So our coding dojo was a weekly time we had set aside to practice programming together to learn things. And we used a specific model of coding dojo where we would use a rotation. And in this rotation, we were basically changing out a pair that's programming. So think of pair programming, two people at one computer. And we were changing that pair every 4 minutes or so. And we would work on simple exercises that would teach us cool coding techniques and technologies, the clean code sort of ideas of how do we make our code easier to work on, easier to understand and enhance, and so on. So the basic idea was just that we were practicing this way. And mob programming itself grew out of that little model, but instead of switching out the pair every few minutes, we basically just replaced the person at the keyboard with someone else, and everybody else on the team, it could be 5 or 6 people, are collaborating together to come up with what is it we're working on and what are we going to do to make this thing into something we can deliver. It's all the brilliant minds working on the same thing at the same time, in the same space, and at the same computer. So that means we're going to get not only the coders, but a tester, a database expert, the product owner or a product expert who understands what they want this thing to do, and whoever else is needed to make this software go from the idea that it is into something somebody can use. And that means we're going to work on pretty small bits and rapidly and as directly as possible turn the idea into delivered code. That might happen over a 2 or 3 hour period, and then we'll take the next little bit and the next little bit. So if you can think of it this way, we have all the brain power, knowledge, and skills together. So there's nothing blocking us from going directly to a finished item. This is very different than the way software development is usually done. We usually picture an individual very focused on some specific task working alone. And this is a whole different way of going about it.
All right. So Woody, I want to take a small step back. I know you've probably been asked this before, but as I'm probably one of the least technical folks on this chat, what you said in the very beginning is very interesting, and it's very simple. Like, we want to find a better way to work together, right? Like that sounds very, very simple, and it sounds and basic in that you can take it a lot of different directions. But I guess, what was when you were first observing this, you and the other group members, why weren't they already working better together already? Like, what was kind of the fundamental things that as engineers and programmers you were missing?
Well, that's an interesting way to look at it. I would say this, that almost none of us anywhere are actually working very well together. We're mostly working alone. So, for 15 years of the first 15 years I programmed, I always worked alone. I didn't have other people to work with. I would write software that was going to be used within the company that I owned. And so I would at night work on the thing I wanted, to grow for the next day. So we mostly spend our entire careers as programmers learning how to work alone and to make it better and easier for us to work alone, not better and easier for us to collaborate with others. We start siloing ourselves, and everyone else silos themselves. Siloing means they learn how to work within their own domain and within their own work specialty area. And we interact through meetings or documents, and we very rarely really collaborate in the work that we're doing. So because we practice doing that all the time, it's hard to collaborate. It's like we've spent our time figuring out how to make our shortcuts, our IDE, our development environment, our techniques suit our own personal preference. rather than how can we collaborate with others, which might mean some of our preferences will be less important to the process than the idea of the collaboration itself. So I don't think that there's any team or programming group out there that isn't at least often working this way, that we work solo. And so, I could give an example. If we have a technical expert on the team, maybe they're the team lead or a tech lead, often somebody will come to them with a question. To be able to get that tech lead to help them, they have to take that tech lead out of the context they're currently in, explain to them the context that, let's say it was me asking the question, the context I'm in right now, get them up to speed enough on it so they can interact with me long enough to give me an answer or the help that I need. And then I go back and do my work, and then I realize, there was something, this isn't working. There was something else I forgot to tell them. I have to go back and interrupt them again. So you can see this pattern happening frequently. And so after a while, people start saying, well, how about we talk every morning at 2 o'clock or every morning at 10 o'clock about, any question anybody has. So we start setting aside meeting time for this. Well, we never can really get the other person completely into the context we're in. So it's always a disruption to them. And we never get the fullness of the understanding that we would hope to have. So I don't think this was specific to this particular group, but they wanted to get better. They wanted to figure out how to, get a better results from the time spent on the projects they were doing. I hope I didn't go too long on that.
No. You hit the nail on the head. I just, I guess if they were the watching the Daniel Pink video, they would you're describing a situation where you were more focused on the autonomy piece, right? So I get that, but it just seems so interesting that it sounds like something like we want to work better together. Like, wow, that doesn't seem like that was really that big of a deal. But I don't think that, it sounds like it's unique to programmers and engineers, but it's probably, if we probably really think about it, it's probably something that affects all of us really in the end, right?
Well, I would agree. There are a number of people who've been working in this space for a long time, though, observing some of these dysfunctions we have about, let's take it in a much bigger sense. A lot of the problems and issues and challenges we've faced over the last 20 or 30 years could be considered single person problems. Somebody could sit down and work on it themselves and come up with an answer. And maybe we're getting fewer and fewer of those because a lot of the things that humans used to do are now done by computers. So we're thinking about, maybe we've moved up a notch now, and we're thinking about problems that are going to take more typically than one person to achieve. People like Amy Edmondson, who wrote the book Teaming, talks about this, and many others do as well. Just the idea that we need to learn how to gather quickly as a group so we can put all the brain power on a bigger problem. This doesn't go just for software development, any kind of knowledge work, but also take a big step forward. Almost any kind of work involves a team somehow. Very little is done in absolute isolation. So we have to figure out, well, what do those collaborations look like? Is it going to be just through documents or through emails or occasional meetings? How are we going to get people aligned? How are we going to get people up to date? So yeah, this is a much bigger thing than just software development.
And the bottleneck when it comes to software development is the creative process, is the problem-solving process. It's not the actual physical act of programming. So by pairing people up and mobbing people up, if we're going to call it that, you're actually reducing the bottleneck chances. That's the way I look at it, right? You have more people thinking about problem solving and being creative at the same time.
Yeah. So I would put it this way. We're really talking about flow.
Yeah.
So if we can think of flow in two different realms, at least. One is the idea, I think, from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. The idea of flow is a psychological flow where we become one with the work that we're doing. We don't notice the passage of time. We feel totally absorbed, and we feel like the ideas are just zooming through. So they call this flowing through us. You can also think about this as being in the zone. That's one kind of flow. But another kind of flow is the flow that we have in the lean sense of the word, that work can go from beginning to end as directly as possible with as little waste, as little inventory as we can have. That's another kind of flow. And so if we can achieve that flow by bringing the people together to do the work, we're now optimizing for the flow of the work instead of optimizing for the output of individuals. The trap, I think that the trap when we are attempting to optimize for the output of individuals is that we pay a very high price for the communication and coordination of that work. We were sort of addressing this earlier, but if we focus on this for a minute, we can think of like an assembly line, the flow and the idea of a factory that's creating something. You can look around the factory floor, and if you see equipment or people with tons of inventory around them, which they're waiting for certain parts to get done so they can assemble them, this is part of the problems of having no flow or having poor flow. The idea that there's inventory sitting there means there's waiting going on. If we take this into software development, it will be things like, I just worked on something and now I have a blocking question. I need to go find somebody who can help me get past this block. Now, it's not going to be the kind of thing that you can look for in a search engine, because those are very general things, but that the whole world might know about. But nobody's going to know things about our own environment or the way we want our product to work once we're done with it. The ideas that the product expert is coming up with, you can't search for those. You got to talk with somebody. And it can also be the other tech people on our team. Maybe we got to talk to the database expert about how we want this data to be stored and so on. So if we separate ourselves and work on these separate in those silos we were talking about earlier, then we've divided up the people who perhaps should be working together so that we get the flow of the work we're doing as directly as possible. Otherwise, we're getting into these processing queues and we're getting into inventory. There's things sitting around waiting to be worked on by someone else.
Right.
And these are, in the lean sense of the word, these are wastes.
So,
and we have to be very careful about that.
Yeah, that's such a great point, Woody. In that same vein of flow, I'm curious because obviously, while you were all talking about this idea of working better together, there was a concept of working better together that was sort of kind of already in place when with the XP idea of pair programming, right? So I'm curious from your perspective, what was the tipping point from all of your observations that how did you see, because there's a sense of flow when there's people pairing on it. And I think that I actually teach pairing on the business side of things because I believe that pairing brings about amazing things on all sides of work. So I'm curious though, there is I don't know how much of a difference between pairing and mobbing around a piece of software. And also like, what was the tipping point of saying like, oh, pairing can get you somewhere, but it can only get you so far. Why don't we just bring other people in? Does that make sense?
Well, yeah. And it would seem like that would have been the path we were going down, but it's not. So in other words, we weren't doing a lot of pairing, which let me say this differently. We had started pairing. Now, I've been doing pairing. I was first introduced to it back in 1998 or 99. It took me 4 or 5 years to be able to get decent enough at it to feel I was proficient with it. But I'd been introduced to it a long time ago. I don't feel that I had found a really effective way of doing it until I worked with Llewellyn Falco on some open source code once, probably back in 2008 or 9. And we had been working together, and we were working on a bit of functionality that he understood the changes he wanted to make. And he said, why don't you come down and work with me on this? And I had a little time off from work. I'd gotten fired from a job, and that's the best way to get some time off. And so I went to spend some time with him, a couple weeks. We would work on this thing. And this was what happened. Now, this is an intermediate step towards what we're talking about. You asked a question, so draw me back to it in a moment. But here's what happened. I sat down with Llewellyn. He explained to me what he wanted. Those of you out there who aren't too technical, just sit with me for a minute here. But he basically said, I want to introduce an alternative way to introduce some functionality into this testing framework we're working on. And what I'd like to do is implement an interface or create an interface from the code that's already there that we can implement both with the old functionality and with the new functionality. And then when somebody's setting up their test, they can choose which one they want to use. So this wouldn't be an unusual thing to do, and I understood all that. So he said, so I said, well, what do you want to do? And instead of him taking the keyboard and starting to type something in, he handed me the keyboard. He said, I'll explain it to you if you don't mind coding it in. So he went to the whiteboard and started talking about it, and he marked off the methods that he wanted me to extract out, and I just started doing it. And after a few minutes, maybe 20 or 30 minutes of that, I noticed the pattern that we were doing was Llewellyn would discuss the idea he had, diagram it on the whiteboard, and then think while I was putting the code in. He would watch what I was doing, and he would correct me if he felt I was going down the wrong path. This was different than how I'd normally worked. Normally, when I worked as a pair programming, somebody with the idea would take the keyboard and they would start typing, and they might explain what they want to do, but it was hard to get the idea. And as they typed it in, the other person, who could be thought of as an observer, is watching the code, hopefully doing sort of a code review, but it's really hard to keep up with that. So you start asking, wait, why are you doing that? And what's that going to be for? Well, that's kind of destroying the flow of the person at the keyboard. So that person at the keyboard will say, wait, you'll see in a minute, and they'll keep on typing. Well, with this model, it reversed this. The person with the idea handed the keyboard off to the other person and started saying out loud the idea. So now we're communicating the fuller intent of the idea rather than just the details. If you watch somebody code, you're just getting snippets of the idea, and it's a lossy communication. The idea's in the other person's head. They're translating it directly into the computer. Now you have to translate it back out. Not necessarily an effective way to go. So this model, it was like in a flash, I'm going, oh man, I like this. All of a sudden, I was getting a full understanding, and I was writing the code, freeing Llewellyn up to do the actual thinking.
So you learned more from this method that Llewellyn did with you as opposed to the previous method. Yes.
Yeah, and so in the previous method, I had to extrapolate from the snippets of the code that were getting written. What is the bigger idea? And this took it the opposite way. The bigger idea was being expressed, and if I understood enough to write the code for it, I could just start doing it. And if I went astray, I could be guided back to what we were trying to do. An interesting thing happens here, and that is that the details are being dealt with in one person's mind, and the bigger idea is in another person's mind, and that allows us to share the cognitive load of this work we're doing. Now, at first, it takes some real practice to do it, but at first, that doesn't seem clear, but it actually worked really well.
So what I love about that, Woody, sorry to interrupt you. Although you gave us permission to do that earlier. What I love about that is someone who is a big Jeff Patton fan, such as myself, the idea of anything that you're working, like the idea that a shared understanding is the point of it. He speaks about that so many times in user story mapping. It sounds to me like this is a technical way of like you're doing user story mapping, but for code, so to speak. And I don't mean that to besmirch what you're describing. It's just this is how I'm kind of correlating. So so you asked us to bring you back to this. How does that translate to the mob method or the group method of this, right?
So first of all, I'm going to agree with you. This is a lot. I really admire Jeff and the things that he's done as well, and it's brilliant. And so if we take it back to what mob programming is, this basic technique changed the way I pair programmed. And at that time, I was calling it driver navigator as opposed to driver observer. And I didn't make up either of those terms. But now we can take that into the coding dojo. In the coding dojo, what we have is 4 or 5 people, maybe more even, who are sitting with a navigator and a driver. So the driver's at the keyboard, the navigator is standing next to the driver, and they have the idea, what are we going to do as we go forward? When we do this as an exercise, we were only allowing one person to talk. When we do mob programming, it's different. But in this exercise, only the navigator is allowed to talk, and the driver can ask a question to clarify things, but that's the extent of it. A funny thing happens when you do this. At first, everybody's impatient. They want to share their ideas as we go, but because we had this rule, you had to learn to stay still. Keep your idea to yourself until it's your turn to navigate. As we gained the skill of doing this, we were learning to let other people finish their sentences and actually finish their ideas. We had another little rule is if we started down a path, so when the timer go off, the next person becomes the navigator becomes the driver, and we're rotating through this switching of the pairs. We had a little bit of a rule that when it's my turn to navigate, I can't just, say, hey, I don't like what we were doing, delete everything, and let's start over with a new way of doing it. If there were tests in place, our choice was to refactor to a better concept or continue on with the concept we have. What this really means is we need to get good at describing our intent so the next person to navigate can take the next step. It's very, in some ways, related to the way improvisation works. We lay out a framework or a storyline, and the next person grows that storyline, and the next person grows that storyline. So we continue in this fashion. Once we started doing this with mob programming, because you can actually see there was this transition, we had been learning to pair program. Now, and we'd been learning to do these coding dojos, which allowed us to learn to interact with each other in a rather nice way. When we started doing this for work, it just accidentally grew out of that process. We'd gather together to look at some code for a project that was problematic. It had a lot of troubled code in it, and the developers who had previously worked on it, one of them was a contractor. They were no longer there, so the people who are going to take it over asked. They said, we really want some help looking at this project. So we decided to do that in a meeting. We gathered together in that meeting, everybody on the team, and we started talking about it. Somebody showed some code, and somebody said, oh, look at that, there's a long method. Well, we know how to fix that. Well, that's something the team didn't know how to fix before, but we've been studying how to fix these things. You've heard a read by refactor, that term. You learn about the code that you need to work on by starting to refactor it. It allows you to read it in a much more complete way.
Right.
And that's what we started doing. And rather than use our model of the coding dojo where only one person's allowed to speak, as soon as we started refactoring this code and the navigator is navigating it, somebody else chimed in with wait, if we do that, that may be not the most effective thing to do. What if we try this? And we started trying different ideas and sharing them in real time. After an hour or so, we had seen great progress in what we were doing, and we had been gaining this shared understanding as a whole team. Somebody came into the room to say, hey, you guys got to leave because we've scheduled this room for another meeting. Well, we could have all just left. We could have just said, yep, meeting's over. Let's go back to our desks. But somebody on the team said, and this was a huge moment for me, said, let's go find another room.
Yeah.
And we just went and did that. And it was a really powerful thing. Go ahead.
Woody, I was going to tell you, so one of the teams I'm working with here, my current client, when I first introduced them to mob programming, we scheduled 90 minutes. We worked on one of their real world problems, and the first half an hour was a bit, I'm not going to say brutal, but it was a bit uncomfortable because they've never really worked together like that before. And they were getting used to the kind of the rules of it and the discipline of the time boxes and everything.
Yeah.
And then after about an hour, I could see that they were having fun. The people that were learning, that didn't know that much about how to do it, were really learning, and they were super into it. So 90 minutes was up. So I said, okay, guys, I got to go. I have to go to another meeting. And I said, do you want me to help facilitate another session for you? Or do you think you have it you think you got it now? And they said, oh, we got it. So apparently, from what I was told, like the rest of the day, they just scheduled the stuff on their own, and they've been mobbing a lot on their own, and they know how to do it now. And they figure, they work on stories together now as a mob, and that was like one little spark of, if I show you how to do something, that spark of once they got it, then they just took it over and they did it better than I could do it. So basically, that was awesome. So that's a similar example from what it sounds like from what you're saying. The first experience is literally I just had this last month here where I'm working. So with this one team.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. This isn't that complicated of a thing. There
Right.
are a lot of nuances to it. We're not automatically going to work well together, and we might find a lot of snags along the way. But we can deal with that. We can figure that out. A team that's sophisticated with working well together, they will quickly identify or notice when they're having problems, and say, hey, we got to handle this. Are we, like we might get on each other's nerves, or we might notice one person tending to try to guide things too much, even when it isn't their area of expertise. We have to remember the point of this is to gather together all the expertise we need so we don't get blocked on things. Now, that can't happen ideally in every case, and it may not be, it might be we just need technical people, but I think normally I would like to see at least a great or a good, a highly capable tester, because the tester point of view is really important. Programmers are usually focused on the task at hand, and the testers are usually focused on how does that fit into the bigger picture, and how do we verify this thing isn't breaking other stuff and that it's doing what we want it to do.
Yeah.
But also having a product owner there, because the product owner is going to bring another perspective, and so on.
So, all right.
So
hold on,
ahead,
Troy.
Chris.
You mentioned something earlier, Woody, that I wanted to just slightly touch on. Is you mentioned this idea of lengthening the story, and I know that you, from a storytelling narrative, having done a small bit of writing, I get the concept of that. I'm curious, though, from your perspective, using this kind of improv style that you mentioned earlier, when you are working on code, like the first thing I thought of was kind of preserving options. Is that a similar concept to lengthening the story when you're writing code, or is it something different?
What do you mean by lengthening the story?
Well, you made a comment earlier that's the maybe I got the phrasing wrong, but this idea of when you were describing intent, right? You're not describing something small and refined. You're trying to the intent of what you're writing. You're trying to not be closed off and more be open about the directions you're headed. I apologize if I got the wording wrong, but I had it in my, I guess maybe I heard it in your head that the story of what you're telling through code, you want to preserve as many options as possible. Is that kind of like what you're thinking of with this improv style?
So, well, that's a good point. I probably would have to give that some thought to answer that well. What I believe I'm trying to say, that maybe you had heard me say, is that as we start in on some work, we're gonna take a small chunk of it to accomplish, and we want to go from beginning to end of a small chunk. And that small chunk, the way that I think of it is, it's something that has to be cohesive. The things are attracted together and belong together and cannot really be separated. And that means they can't be decoupled. So we need to decouple this small cohesive chunk from everything else so we can work on it. It's in the doing of the work that we discover the work that we must do. So no matter how much we think about something and imagine what we want it to be, we still need to work on it in steps. We need to work on it in little steps. If we get good at separating things into potentially usable bits, then we can take that bit from beginning to end as directly as possible, get it into actual use by somebody who's going to be using it for their work or whatever it is they're going to do with it. And that will give us feedback as to, are we stepping in the right direction? So we want to get this pretty rapid feedback loop. Now, a funny thing happens when we start focusing all the knowledge, all the brain power, all the skills and abilities on one thing. We go very directly and very rapidly to something that we can use. So if we do that in baby steps, where if we had separated the work up, it may take us a week or two to accomplish it because of the costs of the communication, coordination, everybody working on different things. If we go from taking a week or two to do it to taking 3 hours to do something, there's a huge win in the rapid feedback loops. So now we have a whole different way to think about stuff. Whereas before, we could limit WIP, perhaps, and everybody knows that's work in process. We're going to limit work in process. We go from doing it by having only enough for this whole group to work on individually to being only one thing, because the whole group is no longer working on things separately. So we're going to work on truly limiting to one thing at a time. And we're going to go from beginning to end. Matter of fact, this is a heuristic that we use. If we can't go on it from beginning to end with the knowledge of this group of people who are here together, then we're missing somebody from the team. And they probably need to be here to be on this team for us to accomplish this work. One of the first questions people ask me is, what's the right number of people to have on a team? And it's not like, 7, give or take 2, or whatever the common ideas people have. I would say it's, if we can work on this without any gaps in our knowledge, we have the right number of people. Now, we might have too many people, and there's a way to adjust for that. And that is for each individual to pay attention. Am I actually contributing or learning something while I'm working on this team and on this bit of work? And if I am, I probably belong here. But if I'm not, I'm probably redundant, or there's enough knowledge already here without me and skills to get this work done. So we can become highly effective by having the right mix of people, so we're never blocked on taking the next step to go from beginning to end on this bit of work.
So Woody, I'll tell you an extreme example of that.
Cool.
When it comes to too many people. Okay. So,
Sure.
So I attended a session by Amitai Schleier called TDD and Mob Programming for Non-Programmers.
Cool.
And I loved it so much, the fact that he was able to figure out how to effectively facilitate mob programming with people who didn't know how to program, but actually have them write the code, like figure out, problem solve a problem. So I took that and I told him I thought it was awesome. And I asked him, do you mind if I, kind of do this? And he said, yeah, sure, go ahead. So I started doing it with teams when I was coaching. And so it didn't really matter if you knew how to code or not. And the thing that I love about it is the fact that everyone gets to drive, even if you don't know how to code, is that the level of abstraction can be varied. So, for instance, if you're a really skilled coder and I just give you a high level idea of what I'm trying to accomplish and you go and start working on it, that's awesome, right? If you're kind of intermediate or beginner, I might have to give you more detail and more instruction. And if you would have no idea how to code, I might have to tell you every single thing to type, right? Those kind of different levels of distraction. So we took this idea and a little plug, but basically at Agile Uprising, we did a live stream where we did this with Amitai and myself and 2 people who had never programmed before. And in 90 minutes via Skype and a live stream, we actually wrote a program. We solved a problem. Basically, we did FizzBuzz, but we did it together using TDD and mob programming. And it's on YouTube. You can check it out. And so I took that idea, and then at a previous client I was at, I was trying to introduce mob programming, kind of trying to get buy-in from a particular business group. So what I did was I said, I'm going to have a 90-minute workshop. Anyone who wants to attend from this business group can come. I don't care if you're a manager, if you're a director, if you're a BA, I don't really care, right? So whoever shows up, shows up. So 30 people showed up, okay, in a room, right? And we did this same mob programming for non-programmers using test-driven development, and we got 15 different people to actually participate through that.
Cool.
And the other 15 mainly observed. And that was really, really eye-opening to me when we got through it, because we actually finished the problem together.
Right.
And only out of the 30 people, only 3 of them were developers. So that was an extreme example of like the way people can collaborate together. You don't have to always focus on who has the most skill. Like it's kind of the opposite mentality of someone has this skill, so they'll work on it. It's more about getting people collaboratively together, problem solving, and coming up with things very fast, and coming up with solutions that maybe one person wouldn't come up with on their own. So that's the story I wanted to tell you some stuff. So shout out to Amatai. Yeah,
that's an excellent example. One of the early, so I was doing coding dojos in this style for a long time before we were doing mob programming. And I did a session at a place a bit after we had started mob programming where we had 18 people in the room, and we worked, we used a language that only one of the people in the room understood, and a work environment, a editor that only one person in the room knew how to use. And yet, by the end of about a 3-hour session, everybody was familiar with the language, and everybody was familiar with the environment. And it was amazing to see that happen. The learning was at an extremely rapid pace. We used some techniques to amplify the learning, such as every time there was a new shortcut expressed, we'd write it down on a big piece of paper and stick it on the wall. So we were getting a collection that was in the eye view of the person at the computer and so on. But, this is the thing. Now, when you have 17 people in a rotation or 18 like we did, that means with a 4-minute rotation, it's an hour or more before you get to the keyboard. It really quickly shows you how anxious we are to speak when we're not allowed to, And so that means that's a skill we got to learn, because if the rule is you're not allowed to speak and people can hardly resist to speak, then when we are not working under that rule, how good are we at containing ourselves? That's a tough thing. That's a very sophisticated collaboration technique, is to keep your mouth shut.
So the way I usually facilitate it, Woody, and maybe you could tell me if I'm quote unquote doing it wrong.
No. There's no such thing.
So basically what we do is usually we start off with 5-minute intervals, and then we see how it feels, right? That's kind of like my go-to thing. So it also depends on the size. So with 30 people, we did 3-minute intervals because we want to have more time, obviously.
Sure.
So typically we do 5-minute intervals. One person's driving. They're not the one actually problem solving. There's a navigator who's basically telling them either whatever level of abstraction, what to write, essentially, right? Then, but I do encourage that one person is kind of leading this, but everyone else in the mob can chime in when they feel like they have ideas,
Sure.
Instead of not talking. That's what the difference I'm hearing from.
Well, so that is mob programming, but doing mob programming with, hopefully people out there understand, we're talking about huge numbers, and teams would normally be working with, 3 or 4 people or up to 8 or 10 people, depending on what problems they're trying to solve. The idea is not that only one person will talk. That's pure. That can talk and everyone else can't. That's the coding dojo. So that model helps us learn that we can control ourselves, that there is a hope for us to collaborate. When we're working as a team, we have to realize that when somebody has started a thought, we don't necessarily need to interject our thought. We can allow their thought to play out first. Let them explain it. If it doesn't look like it's totally out there, like something that we shouldn't try at all because it's not related to what we're doing, let's give it a try. Let's get good at trying everybody's ideas, and eventually we'll get a high skill at trying things rapidly. What I've found is if you have conflicting ideas, two people have very different ways of approaching a problem, and we want to spend time deciding which one we'll use, we maybe are short-circuiting or trying to short-circuit a system or an approach that would work better than us trying to decide ahead of time. Let's try one, and if that what we learn from that will feed the other idea. Rather than saying, let's decide which one we'll do first, let's pick, you can flip a coin, pick one or the other and do it. One of the things that we did back at Hunter at one point was, let's try the more junior person's idea first, some way to make the decision. So let's try the idea and then try the other idea. Now, usually, if you try two ideas, we all know what will happen. We'll come up with another idea. So let's not just say it's going to be one or the other. It's something my dad used to say. He was an engineer and electronics engineer, and he did switching and stuff in the phone company. He would say, hey, there's 1,000 right ways to do anything, so let's not get too stuck on any one idea. If you think that your idea is the right way, you've already fooled yourself.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point.
There's no one right way, and if there's only one clear right way right now, that's just because we haven't given ourselves enough time to try possibilities. Doing something will lead to new ideas.
So
we've gone for quite a while, and I don't think we've covered very much off of our list of things we wanted to cover.
We never do. Does it make you feel any better, Woody? Yeah. We're almost at time, but we can definitely have you back in soon and talk about. Honestly, this is one of those topics where it's so. I don't know about Troy, but this is such a layered idea and concept that we could probably do a series on mob. But what I will say is that maybe.
Well, before you go any further, I would plead with you to do that. Let's do a series on mobbing.
Okay.
On mob programming. That's a great idea.
I guess. Sorry, Troy. I don't know if you have a better ending question. I will. But just from let's figure out a way to make this something active for people to get more curious. What's something that for any of our listeners that have never tried this before? What's something simple or either for them to check out, to read for more ideas, or just even to say, hey, I want to try this. What's just a simple way for them to get started on a journey into this concept?
Well, for starters, there is a short video that we had made, a time lapse that only goes about 3 minutes or so of an entire day of us working this way. So you can find that on YouTube. You just search on mob programming. There's two versions of it now, one we made in 2012 and one that was made in 2016. The one in 2012 is of a single team. The one in 2016 shows a whole floor or a whole room of about 6 teams doing mob programming all day long. So just watch one of those two videos and read the little snippets that come up and get an idea of what that looks like. And to be really clear, that simple video and this little tip is probably enough to give it a bit of a shot. And this tip comes from Llewellyn, and it's the guiding mechanism of what I would call the driver navigator as I had learned it. And it's that for an idea to go from somebody's head into the computer, it must go through someone else's hands.
Wow.
Yep, I use that quote all the time.
Yeah, if you're at the keyboard and you feel you want to navigate for a while, or you feel that you want to share your idea, you move off the keyboard. Let someone else take the keyboard. Now, I want to share two ideas that'll help go through this, and then one or two approaches to starting. So the one idea is that if we have a good concept of what to do, and we can navigate that by one person just taking it from beginning to end, and because most ideas only take a few minutes to do, that's great. At any point, if that navigator feels they're not really making the progress they want to do, you kind of tag team. You just say, hey, can somebody else help guide through this? And so that's kind of a beginning. But I think an important concept here is that if we start on something simple, like that's very focused, like a bug fix, or just an exercise, like something new we want to learn, or a kata, like a coding exercise we want to do, so there's less pressure. Pardon me. So there's less pressure than our normal work, because I've found that if we work through some difficult deadline work, it's hard to pay attention to learning to interact well when we're under that pressure. Let's relieve ourselves of that pressure so we can focus on, am I able to keep myself from interjecting whenever I have an idea, or should I learn to be more patient and wait for the right moment to give that idea? Let's not worry about jumping ahead as fast as possible. Let's learn at getting the fullness of everybody's involvement and things like that. So the one idea is a bug fix. The other idea is maybe just use it as a learning exercise to get us started, so we can start learning to interact with less tension and less pressure than our normal work. We'll figure it out.
Troy, is that a good ender? Did we get it at all?
Yeah. Yeah, let's end, and let's just give some plugs as far as websites. Any websites to check out, Woody, for people?
Well, so first of all, I want to make sure that we do a good plug, and maybe we could pop in something at the beginning for this as well, for the upcoming mob programming conference.
Okay. When is that?
So that's April 12th and 13th. It's in Boston. It's actually near Boston. This will be our third year. The basic idea is to be as hands-on as possible. We're gathering together people who have been doing mob programming from pretty much all over the world to come in and share their expertise and their knowledge with whoever's interested in mob programming. And really, the experts are going to be helping each other learn, because we've all been taking different approaches. The concept of this conference is to be hands-on and to be sort of like an open space technology style conference, where the people who come will develop and share the ideas of what this conference is going to be about. We've got Marcus Hammarberg from Sweden. We've got Llewellyn Falco will be there. Of course, I will be there. So on and so on. I don't want to go too much into it. We have a lot of people. Lisa Crispin will be there. We've got a lot of people who have been doing mob programming at different levels for up to 5 or 6 years. And if there's a limited attendance, I think we'll max out at about 120 or so people. So be sure you get your slot sooner rather than later. I think we're still in the early bird period.
Now, what's the website for this conference?
Yeah, so we can put that into the links, but this is being done in conjunction with the Agile Games Conference, which I believe is April 9th through 11th, and then our mob programming conference is the 12th and 13th. It's at a Microsoft facility up in Burlington, Massachusetts, very close to Boston, next town over, so to speak.
All right.
So I'll get you a link to put in on that.
Awesome. And I got one more. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Woody.
Well, you want to. So there's several websites, but we have one that's called mobprogramming.org. It has a bunch of articles on it already, and I'm starting to become active on it again to add new things. So that's a place people can start. And I've written a book on the topic, although it's still a work in progress. It is available through LeanPub, which allows you to write a book in electronic form as you go. And it's pretty much fleshed out, but I've still got some changes and some new chapters I want to add. So that's another place to get information.
Awesome. So what will we search on LeanPub to find your book?
Mob programming.
Okay, fair enough.
So that'll be right there. If you search, and we could put those links into... this is pretty straightforward. Just put mob programming into a search engine, and you will find tons of stuff, people who've done talks and shared videos from all over the world. And then you just see lots of pictures of me.
Does mob programming have as many internet trolls as the no estimates crowd does?
Boy, I hope not.
So I wanted to give one plug for the uprising. I wrote a blog post about mob programming a few weeks ago, and it's called "Stopping the Enterprise Death Spiral with Mob Programming." So that's on the Agile Uprising blog. So if you go to agileuprising.com and check out the blog, it's one of the most recent posts on there. So, Woody, where can people find you on Twitter? What is your Twitter handle?
Woody Zuill. And so that's kind of easy to find. If you search on mob programming or no estimates in Twitter, you'll find me somewhere in there as well.
Awesome.
And so, and I love to hear from people, and I love to hear from what I would consider opposite point of view as well. I'm really happy to have the discussions on the harder things. It's hard to do that in Twitter. So once we get introduced, I'm always open to have a talk via Skype or whatever. So I'd love to hear your audience's stories about mob programming, their successes, and maybe their not so successes. Which some people would call failures, but in this case, they're just experiments. So I'd love to hear. I do workshops on this, of course, and I'm happy to speak at conferences. So let me know. I'm planning out the next year. I've got a pretty busy first of the year, but I've always got openings coming up. So I'd love to do that.
Awesome. I think Troy may be having some technical difficulties, but he is Troy Lightfoot, and I am Chris Merman. And Woody, thank you so much for spending some time with us.